Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from. Welcome to the next installment of the EdSurge is the webinar. My name is Tony Wan, and I am the managing editor here at EdSurge. Just really quickly, EdSurge is a news and information research helping bringing you the best in education technology through our news, stories, research programs, and community activities, which include both live conferences, back when we were able to have them, and also online events, such as this webinar. EdSurge is also a part of ISTE, that's short for the International Society for Technology in Education. ISTE is a nonprofit organization that serves students and mostly educators interested in the use of technology in education. So for today's webinar, we've lined up three dynamic thought leaders and practitioners on the impact of coronavirus on K-12 education. And specifically, we're going to explore what it means to set reasonable goals, expectations, and routines for remote learning, with an emphasis on the word reasonable. So a really quick note before we begin. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be made available to you via email after the live event. And if you've signed up for the webinar, you'll also receive updates about future webinars on this topic, which we plan to host more with some regularity in the coming months. You may also ask questions throughout this webinar using the Q&A feature in Zoom. And as we're able to, we will bring your questions up into the conversations and our discussions. We also encourage you to use the chat function to say hello and to share links to resources, to introduce yourselves. But I encourage you, if you do have questions, please put your questions into the Q&A and not the chat. Now, before we get started, I just want to draw your attention to a guide from EdSurge and ISTE, and it's called Navigating Uncertain Times, How Schools Can Cope with Coronavirus. And this is a guide where we've organized and collected all of our stories from our reporters and from our contributors, and some really helpful resources about how educators are wrestling and coping during this stressful time. And I encourage everyone to take a look at it. It is online at readiness.edsurge.com. I also want to draw your attention to a news site from ISTE and a host of other education groups called Learning Keeps Going, and which also features tons of resources, including an educator help desk. And that link is learningkeepsgoing.org. We'll drop that into the link to that in the chat later on. So we'll get right into it. I would like to introduce our panelists on today's call, and I'm so honored that they are able to share their time and expertise with us on such short notice. So today we are joined by Angela Estrella. She's the instructional coach at the Stanford Graduate School of Education. We also have Kerry Gallagher, who is the assistant principal for teaching and learning at St. John's Prep in Massachusetts. And last but not least, we've got Stacey Roshan. She is a math teacher and the director of innovation and educational technology at the Bullis School in Maryland. So they will be sharing their perspectives and tips throughout this conversation. And if any of them strike your fancy, we encourage you to share their comments on Twitter. And you can find their Twitter handles on that slide, or I think my colleague will also share our Twitter handles in the chat as well. So as I said, I'm gonna have a few quick questions at the beginning, and then we will be able to take some of your submitted questions. I apologize in advance. In the previous, there's been a lot of great questions, and I can't guarantee that we will get to everything, but I'll try to get to the ones that are most salient and pertinent to our conversation. So to start off with, I'd like to, ask Angela. Angela, so in your role as an instructional coach, I imagine you've been working with teachers, from different backgrounds and working in different environments in recent weeks. To start off with, share a little bit more about your work as an instructional coach, and maybe share a little bit about the range of common concerns and questions that you've heard in recent weeks.
Thanks, Tony, and hello to everyone in the community. It's great to see that we have people from across the country, and I see Vietnam, Italy. I really appreciate your time here. To answer your question, in my role as an instructional coach, I'm currently working with teachers across the country, from Hawaii, California, and New York, and everything in between. And there are some common themes that are coming up for teachers around, what's reasonable in terms of managing expectations. And if some of what I share resonates with you, I'd love for you to put that in the chat and also share as well what's coming up for you as well. And so a couple of themes that are pretty prominent. One is just navigating changing expectations. So across the country, whether it's in Texas, New York, or here in California, where I'm at in San Jose, teachers are sharing that, each week the expectation changes. And so it's really hard to have a routine with these changing expectations. So that's a big one. Another is that in terms of the needs of students are changing week by week. So what seemed reasonable 2 weeks ago now does not seem reasonable. And so that's a big one of having support, like how am I adjusting to this rapidly changing situation? And the other is just, I want to say, is a thought partner, like having somebody to talk through what's reasonable, right? Teaching's already an isolating profession, but in this distance learning, remote learning, whatever you want to call it, it can feel even more isolating, right? And what I'm hearing a lot from teachers is just wanting a thought partner to process out loud how they're making decisions about what's reasonable in these very challenging times.
Thank you. Kerry, from your role as an assistant principal, anything, I imagine there's probably a lot of overlap between what Angela shared and maybe what your colleagues are sharing. You have anything to add to that, or anything new in addition that you've seen in your work?
Yeah, I think it's really important, like Angela mentioned, for people to feel like they have someone that they can talk to who understands what they're experiencing, both as a teacher and just as a human right now. And for many of our teachers, also what they're experiencing as a parent while they're still trying to be a teacher. So I think it's important for school leaders to provide our faculty members with opportunities to connect and even help facilitate those connections with one another so that they do feel like they have someone who is not just telling them guidelines or rules, but is actually listening to their concerns and really caring about what they're saying and expressing. I think that's an important thing for us to do.
Great. Now, Stacey, you kind of wear like dual hats, right? A little bit. I mean, you're both a classroom teacher, or back when we have classrooms to go to, you're both a teacher and you're also, working in an administrative role as Director of Education Technology. How do you kind of, from those two different perspectives, I mean, like, what have you seen or heard or experienced yourself or heard from your colleagues about like questions about what's reasonable, what are reasonable expectations at this time?
Yeah, and I think that something difficult from the teaching standpoint is, we always know that one size does not fit all for all students, but we kind of have gotten used to some of the different needs of different students. And right now there's so much other things that we have to consider, such as we don't know what's really going on at home with the student. Is somebody sick in their family or something like that might be weighing them down, or do they need to take care of some of their siblings at home during the day while their parents are working also at home? And so it's just, there's so much more going on. And, I think that a lot of us are trying to scale back on work, which is needed. But I'm also seeing, and I teach an AP class, I'm seeing some of my students do so much work and doing some of the optional work that I'm assigning because they're preparing for the AP exam. And striking a nice balance there has been hard to know, there is no knowing, but I do see that some of them are putting in extra work than ever before. And I think they're seeing real wins from, doing that work and me communicating back with them and feeling a sense of pride in that. So just striking that balance for students and knowing what they need, but just as many listening opportunities as I can do. So we do like a weekly check-in Flipgrid so I can see their face and kind of hear from them is helpful. And then for teachers right now, I think I'm very lucky that I'm at a school where we have done a lot of professional development on kind of a core suite of ed tech tools that we use at our school, and those have served us really well right now. But again, just making sure that we're not using too many different tools, both to overwhelm students and parents, because parents are helping with things, but also not to overwhelm the teacher by, trying to take advantage of all these free tools that have been made free right now. It's wonderful and great, but I'm doing a lot of that in my role right now and trying to brainstorm with teachers about, okay, should I use this other tool, or maybe I should use something that we have already used and students have already used and are comfortable with, and we can kind of work it out that way.
Yeah, certainly we've seen and heard from many teachers and schools and educators and communities starting to adopt technologies to help supplement and support instruction during this time. But, we've also seen that poses challenges as well, whether some tools are just not the right fit, or whether there's just, there are logistical hurdles or challenges involved in trying these on short notice. Kerry or Angela, I mean, what kind of guidance have you given to your teachers about, like, what's a reasonable or appropriate number of technologies to try, or like, do you want them to try new things at this time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Angela, if you don't mind, we actually at St. John's Prep, we're 5 weeks in to the remote learning process. So we were fortunate to be able to transition faster than a lot of other schools in our area, because we already had a pretty strong LMS. We use Canvas that we had already trained our teachers on, and our students were accustomed to using it. Our parents were used to being able to access it to see their sons work. And so that has been a benefit, that there's a foundational tool that was already well established that has allowed for the communication and digital workflow. Even with that in mind, though, we put together a set of guidelines that it was a partnership between administration, department chairs, curriculum coordinators who worked together on this document, and then that was shared with the faculty. We provided virtual trainings so that people who might need some support could meet those minimum guidelines. But then 2 weeks later, we sent out a community-wide survey to parents, teachers, and students, and found out what was working well based on those initial guidelines and what needed to be adjusted. And so we made some tweaks, again, provided professional learning to help people adjust to those tweaks, did one more survey 2 weeks later, and now we're sort of making our final transition. And this will be the model that we use through the rest of the school year, which is going to be another 6 weeks or so, now that we found out 2 days ago from our governor that our schools are closed for the school year, like many other states. So I think it's important that whatever the guidelines might be for which tools you use, that they are created collaboratively with all the leaders in the school, and that there's support provided for teachers. It doesn't mean teachers shouldn't try new things, but they really need to give their students time to get in the groove and really be comfortable with those foundational tools first before jumping into something new.
Yes, I want to add on. 3 weeks ago when I was meeting with teachers, which now really feels like 6 months ago, but 3 weeks ago, there was a lot of excitement in wanting to try lots of tools, trying to engage learners in lots of different ways to meet their needs. In the past week, I've seen a huge shift with teachers who are like, we're using the Google Suite, and that's pretty much it. Maybe a little Flipgrid if that was already used. And a lot of this was feedback from students. Kerry, I really appreciate how you were sharing there was an effort to get stakeholders in feedback, in a survey. I'm seeing teachers do a lot individually, as well as trying to get feedback from their students, and hearing a call from their students that they're very overwhelmed with all the different platforms. So definitely less is more, and that constraint poses a challenge, but also can be really grounding in being able to meet the needs of students.
Great. So I want to see whether the expectations or routines are maybe changing, or maybe whether we're settling into some more routines now that, I think it's been about a month, I think, since mid-March, when the school closure announcements started coming out, and it happened around spring break. And, initially I imagine it was probably pretty chaotic when it first happened. But right now as we're learning that many schools are going to be closed for the rest of the year, or is your school community, are you considering this, have you moved to a different phase of this transition process where school leaders and teachers should be expecting to settling into some more norms and routines about the next 2 months?
So I can answer that because we definitely have at St. John's. Initially, we started with a completely asynchronous model with only optional live virtual office hours that were not mandatory for students. And we did this because we knew this was going to be a transition, not just for the students that we serve, but for their families. And we wanted to respect that their family would need some time to adjust. And we also wanted to provide our teachers with some flexibility so that they could adjust with their own families and also have the flexibility to attend the virtual workshops they might need to successfully provide remote teaching for their students. But now that we're over a month in, the feedback we got from our community is that they're really craving more synchronous class time. They really want that face time. And so our final phase of remote learning, one transition or change that we're making is that we're going to provide more of a hybrid model where it is still asynchronous, but there are some expectations that synchronous face-to-face learning will be happening.
I'll say that we almost went the opposite route. We started with every day was kind of the normal school day. And so we went 8 to 3. And we had still assemblies and stuff, and we were just, students were going from Google Meet to Google Meet instead of going from class to class. And that, that was the first phase when we thought it was going to be 2 weeks. And then when we went further, we have been surveying parents and students, and we moved to a 4-day-a-week model so that on Fridays, everybody, teachers and students, could have a rest and reflect day, which has been really wonderful to have that. And so we have a modified, we had a 4-day-a-week schedule already for, because there's so many weeks where we have holidays and we didn't want to take any class time away. So we make sure that all the blocks are evenly distributed over those 4 days. And so, right now in Maryland, we are supposed to go back on May 15th. Whether that will actually happen or if it will be shifted, we don't know yet. We're waiting for the state to make that decision. But I do think we'll reevaluate it again. I think in some ways it's very nice for students to be able to, and that was our beginning thought, was that, we wanted students to have some sense of normalcy and still, wake up and kind of go through their day with some routine, and we wanted to help with that. And then being able to see their classmates. I know that a lot of them really enjoy that, especially our lower schoolers. Even over spring break, they wanted to have class sessions, and they did. Their teachers allowed that to happen. So, I think it's difficult, and I think it might be most difficult for parents or teachers who are parents and have their kids to take care of. I don't have that to juggle, but I can't even imagine how difficult that is when you have a rotating schedule. That it's a lot.
I'm seeing people are loving in the chat this rest and reflect day, and then we have some people sharing mindful Mondays. I think what both Kerry and Stacey, what you share speaks to, one, it's so important to get the feedback from students and families as you're thinking about how you move forward. I'm seeing, just as a coach, it looking really different depending on the state and the community, but I am seeing a trend more towards as well, most of the time being asynchronous, just because of so many challenges in terms of deployment of devices, where students aren't having access to a device or they're having to share. So it's really hard to engage in synchronous learning. Also something that we're seeing the comments, screen time fatigue and the toll that's taking. I know right before this call, I made sure that my teenager got outside for some exercise. So I think the big thing here really that's resonating is responding to the needs of your local community.
Yeah, that's great. I did notice the screen time comment as well, and I think it does tie into the synchronous comment that you made, Kerry. If at the risk of diving into maybe too specifics, but I think maybe our audience will want to know as you're planning, synchronous activities or class time, online class time, what are some of your guidance on like limits or how long these classes do at your school?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, because our teachers have wondered that too from us and really want clarity. So our guideline is that each course should meet at least once a week in a synchronous way. It should be a minimum of 30 minutes, a maximum of about 50 minutes, and that the students should know by Monday morning at 8 a.m. when each class will meet synchronously so that they have time to plan ahead, to set that time aside and create a space for them to really attend and be present. We also have asked our teachers to only schedule their synchronous class time when their class would normally meet in our daily schedule, and that will prevent any student from being double booked and having to choose between classes. We don't want that to happen. And then finally, the last guideline is that we're going to ask teachers to try to make sure that that synchronous class time helps students complete a learning task while they are together with their teacher. And so that could be, we don't want teachers, in other words, to just be lecturing and expecting students to be sitting in front of a screen and taking notes. We want that time to be collaborative and social and to create connections and allow students access to their teacher to ask questions if they need help. So those are the guidelines that we've set in place. So when I say it's hybrid synchronous, it really is only one class meeting a week. So it isn't a lot of time in front of the screen, but it's enough that they have a face-to-face connection with a person who's been an important adult in their life at least once a week.
Kerry, I love what you describe and the points that you made a lot. I think something that's, very challenging right now is that what we're doing right now isn't online learning. It's like this urgent need that we've moved remote. And so I think one of the hardest things is it takes a lot of training around how you restructure your lessons. For example, I've taught in the past a purely online version of AP Calculus, and right now I'm teaching a face-to-face AP Calculus that has gone remote, and the two things aren't the same at all. I taught the same class online, but it was structured differently. My design of that course was different, and my expectations and routines from the beginning of the year were very different. And so, I think that one of the most difficult things right now is really helping teachers develop a real synchronous or asynchronous lesson that is made for an online setting and isn't just, us now getting on a Google Meet and me kind of doing what I would do in class and then giving kids time to break out and do work because that's what they would have done in the classroom. And so I think that, for us, like our first phase of having everybody go from class to class helped teachers kind of have a chance to transition some things and still use some of the stuff that they were going to use in the classroom, because it's been, like in this next phase of getting people to create more of the asynchronous learning tasks is when I've so enjoyed, from my perspective, in my role, brainstorming with teachers and helping them get there. But, I'm really, really curious about, thinking even to the fall, what if this happens again where we have to go remote? What kind of training are we going to be able to do for teachers, and when are we going to do that training for the teachers so that they can really be prepared? Because right now I feel like we're all functioning under an emergency scenario, and I also want to be super mindful that teachers desperately need the summer to take a break. And so I am really curious about how we are going to get prepared for fall.
Great. We have now a lot of good audience questions that kind of get into a little bit more the specifics about what you're doing or what your guidelines are for your community and school. One of them comes from Gina. I'm a high school counselor, and Gina is struggling to get students to submit any work online. And I think that's a good segue into just asking about what your guidance is around, like, what are your expectations, routines around just like homework or like assignments, or just making, or do you want to have expectations that students are like sending things in or submitting, still doing homework online?
I can answer that one. So yes, we're asking students to complete, it depending on the grade level, about 90 minutes of work per class per week for middle schoolers and about 2 hours per class per week for high schoolers. And that can be a little bit more for students in AP classes because they're preparing for their exams. And once the exams are over, they're sort of done anyway. So their school year ends a little earlier. In terms of the students who are not submitting, number one, our seniors are really struggling because they're upset. And so I think that's something we have to keep in mind in terms of their social emotional well-being and being understanding, but also providing support and opportunities for them to connect and just understanding how important is the academic for them right now, given what they're going through, right? But we have like tiers of intervention that we developed that customized for this circumstance. So if a teacher really doesn't hear anything from a student, no submissions, they're not attending virtual office hours, they're not responding to emails, then there's like tiered supports. So in our middle school, it's looping in the school counselor. Well, first of all, making sure you reach out to the parents first, but then looping in the school counselor or the team leader. If the student has a learning coach, making sure we're looping in the learning coach so that we can find out, is this a trend across all their classes? Is it just in one class? And that way that student isn't going to be bombarded with an email from each of his 6 teachers. He gets one point of contact from a school counselor that can help create a more holistic plan that meets the need of the person. So we're understanding that sometimes if they're not turning in work, it's a symptom of a different issue that we need to make sure that that student is addressing first, and then the academics come next once we know that that child is well.
Great. All right. Let's see. I mean, there are a few other questions that we're getting into as well that I kind of also wanted to touch on. I think one of these goes back to some of the earlier comments about, I think, Andrew, that you shared about like every week, it just feels like the situation is changing or has been changing. And so how do you work with students, parents, and staff to create kind of weekly goal, reasonable weekly goals, given that, the change of pace, I think, things are still changing, I think, week by week, maybe not as chaotically, as the initial months, but what are you recommending or suggesting to teachers at this time?
Great question. So I love, again, this time for reflection and thinking about how we build that in for teachers. And it's so overwhelming and so many things are changing, that one thing that's really important that I want to emphasize is building on our strengths, like what worked well, and really lifting those up. Kerry, you shared that video of the flash mob, and I think there's, with things being so heavy, there's still celebrations of things that are going well, especially things that are grounded in building community and relationships. And so I think a lot of what I'm doing in the coaching sessions, yes, it's a space where teachers especially want to process, they want to do some venting of their frustration, and we all need that. But a key piece that we're talking about is what is actually going well, what is something that we can build on, and what are some of the things that we're going to have to let go. And so a big call would be for building in that time, and that we create that time to support teachers to do that work.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up. It's been nice that at our school, we've been doing like some virtual coffee hours when usually we have a 15-minute snack. So sometimes it's as short as that. And then also some happy hours after school, and using Zoom and even putting people into different breakout rooms and shuffling breakout rooms just to allow people to continue to talk with one another. And, I do think it's so important. Somebody in the chat was talking about wellness checks for students. I think it's important for teachers too. I think right now what I'm realizing is that, when you email somebody, it always sounds like everything's well, it doesn't always, but a lot of times it sounds like everything's okay. You know, you're missing that cue of like knowing when somebody's just off, a colleague who is also a friend. And so I think it's important to remember to do some of those face-to-face just check-ins. It's not going to feel the same as in person. You won't sense that same thing, but just making sure that, you know, everybody is okay somehow. I think that that visual of the video is really helpful.
I've also just been replying to emails by picking up the phone and dialing people's numbers, colleagues' numbers. I think even just sometimes people are like, wow, I just emailed you. I'm like, I know, that's why I'm calling. I figured we could just chat about it and I could hear your voice. And I've been doing that for parents and students too. And since I'm at home and I'm calling from my personal cell number, I just hit *67 and then my number is hidden so that privacy is protected on my end. But again, I think like I spoke to 2 different students today who were trying to make up work and helped him troubleshoot an app on his iPad while we were on the phone. And I think that makes a big difference and shows that you really care in a different way than when he emailed me asking the question, just saying, then just use something different, find a different way. I picked up the phone and called him and we had a nice, and we got to also talk about other things like his dog, and, you know, it made that personal connection is important.
Yeah, Kerry, to your comment earlier about that, you know, for some students, academics just may not be the most pressing or important or critical thing in their lives right now. I do want to explore this area around it, how all the panelists on this webinar think about how do you strike that balance between trying to set some meaningful, explicit learning goals, versus being flexible and accommodating to the fact that this is kind of a crazy time. And then academics just may not be the top of mind and priority for some kids and families. Does this tie into, I think, one of the Q&A questions from Bushra? Are we lowering the standard academically a little bit too much? Or how do we try to adjust academic expectations so that they're kind of fair and reasonable and perhaps flexible to accommodate the different home environments that students are in?
I'll start with this one. We were having a conversation about grades recently and teachers were saying, well, my grades for this, we're on trimesters, my grades for this trimester are really inflated. And we're grading something different. I think most of us right now are grading effort rather than mastery. And I think it's okay, honestly, in the situation that we are in right now. I can't even begin to imagine how hard this is for our seniors, for teenagers who are staying inside, for our littlest ones. I mean, it is just, we're in such a terribly difficult situation right now. I think it is okay if their grades are inflated. And at our school, we're taking a do no harm approach. And so students who are thriving right now and who are doing better, that grade will be reflected on their final report card. And they're going to see that bump in the 3rd trimester and it will help their overall average. But for kids who are really struggling right now, it can't harm their grade. So they can just take their grade from the 1st and 2nd trimester and the exam. They've already taken exams because we have them after our 2nd trimester. And for the kids who are really, really falling off and not completing anything and who are failing right now, will need to complete some essential activities that the teacher will choose, and they will have a window of time to make up that work. And so that in that way, it can't just be that, kids are falling off the radar completely and stopping, but yet it still gives some flexibility there. And I think that's the key right now, is that flexibility.
Right, you talked about grades. I think even in normal times, grades will always open up a can of worms in the conversations, and I'm seeing a lot of chatter and comments right now in the box. But Kerry or Angela, what are, or maybe Kerry first, I mean, what is St. John's doing about grades, or your approach to grades?
Yeah, so in Massachusetts, it had the public schools have gone to like complete or incomplete for the 4th quarter for their final grades. For public schools. So I have a 2nd grader and a 5th grader who are in public school in the city where I live. And so it's really just about making sure that they're demonstrating effort toward completing some of the remote learning that their teachers have put together. But if they don't complete all of it, that's understandable. under the circumstances. So that's what the public school perspective has been. At St. John's, we are using grades for this quarter, and a couple of the reasons behind that is, number one, our teachers really are superheroes in terms of how they've adjusted and learned and have been creative in providing really high quality academic experiences via these remote circumstances. So number one, we want to make sure that we're sending that message to our parents and students that we value the work of our teachers and it is worth the effort for their children to participate in it. Number two, just adolescents are, by nature, they make mistakes and they have ups and downs in their lives from month to month and year to year. And so for many students, you know, maybe they had a first and second quarter that were really tough and they were really just hitting their groove third quarter, and they were really depending on that fourth quarter to bring up their overall average that's going to go on their transcript. If we move to pass fail, how might that take that opportunity away from those students? With all of that in mind, we are asking our teachers to accept late work without penalty as much as possible. We're asking teachers to really change up the assessment types that students are doing. We don't want students just reading and answering questions in every class, or just completing problem worksheets in every math or chemistry class. And so we're providing a lot of professional learning on what remote assessment looks like and how it can be much more creative than maybe the traditional assessments that people have relied on in the past.
A couple things I want to add on. First, I dropped in the chat a great spreadsheet to kind of see how different states are responding to this very question. It was put out by the MIT's Teaching and Research Lab, and there's no one answer. Like the states have different takes on this, and then also at a local community. One thing, a couple of things I want to highlight though is that we want to think about when we have grades, what do those serve? Like Stacey, in your position, for the AP class, students are still going to take that AP class. We know across the country, standardized tests have been canceled for this year. When we think about colleges and universities, how they're responding to students who are articulating with what roles grades play. So I wanted us to think about that the role grades served in the system that we had before COVID-19, and that we're currently not in that system. And we want to be careful that we're not imposing that system now, because when we talk about grades, what we will be graded on is the wellness that we had for our school communities. And that's something that we're all going to have to look at, because those are the grades that are going to count. The wellness that we had for our students, the families, the communities, and the educators, all the staff that are involved. And those are the grades that are really going to matter. Last thing, in terms of one thing to think about too, if you're like really holding on to, I gotta have this accountability, I gotta have this grades, that also could be a sign of loss and grief. You know, one thing that we all have to check with ourselves, and I'm having to do it on a daily basis, is just the loss that we're experiencing, that school is not what it was. You know, and part of that grief of the loss is like wanting to hold on to those elements, right? But that we know that we currently are, especially at a time where some of you, maybe you're being asked to clean out your classroom, right? Like, you know, all of those signs of what the end of the school year are reminders. We're constantly inundated with the loss that we're experiencing. And so one thing we want to maybe sit with is when we're trying to hold on to what we know, that's a sign for us that we need to take care of ourselves as well.
Yeah, very powerful comment, Angela, that just I think resonates with a lot of the audience just based on the chat points. Maybe a segue from that, as we talk about well-being, you know, of our, you know, not just, you know, maybe stepping aside from academics a little bit, but the well-being of families and our communities. There is a question around, you know, what we can do or reasonably, you know, provide to parents to help them navigate this as well. A lot of teachers are also parents of children. I think that applies to some of you on this call. What are, I mean, any guidance on how to best provide parents support at this time, or kind of have parents be allies in the work that teachers are doing?
Absolutely. So as someone who is juggling both, as I know many are, also it's interesting because my husband is still going to work every day, so he's not here. I think it's really shown a light on how important partnerships are in parenting, because it is different to be alone all day and working and managing their schoolwork for my children, because they're young. They really can't do it on their own. They do need an adult to help provide structure and support. I think one thing is I appreciate that my children's teachers have given me permission to have them do their work at a time that maybe isn't during the school day, because that's when I have to be working. And so we're doing some of their work on the weekends, or we're doing it early in the morning, but then they're kind of done with their schoolwork by 8 a.m. because that's when my professional work day starts. So that's been helpful. Also, just being available. I think when we've sent out those community surveys at St. John's, one of the things that we've made sure to do is if a parent takes the time to write a narrative comment, sharing a little bit of their story and their experience, someone at our school picks up the phone and calls that person and talks to them. So that number one, they know somebody read their comment, and number two, they know that it was heard. And it doesn't mean that every phone call ends with somebody who's satisfied and happy. I mean, there are situations that are tough, and nothing can work perfectly for everybody, but at least we're working hard at making sure that the parents understand that our relationships with them matter as much to us as our relationships with their children.
One thing I want to add on, I think this is relationships with parents is really challenging, especially in the secondary level, because this is not where you might have as much interface, but it's really important. And this is an area where we need to support our teachers. I'll say this, I have 9 years teaching experience. I've been an instructional coach for 6 years, and I'm also trained in counseling psychology. I have a teenager, and I feel every day like I'm failing as a parent to help my kid with remote learning. So if you feel like you're struggling, you're not alone. We all are struggling. We're just trying to do the best that we can. And I think that is something that we can really resonate. And the value of educators at our sites who are parents who are trying to juggle, they bring a perspective that's so important that we can think about how we creatively how we can support one another. And so I think what you've been hearing from the other panelists, ways to engage parents, I think a lot of what parents need to know is just that it's okay, right? It's okay, like that they have a space. One big thing that I do a lot of just in my family members is messaging them and letting them know it's okay that you're struggling. Like it's time to put those assignments down. It doesn't matter if they haven't completed those, because your wellness is most important.
There is actually, I saw a pretty interesting question in the chat. Where did that go? It was, I think if I recall, it was about, have any of you had needed to have some like a tough conversation with parents about setting kind of level setting for them? Maybe they have some unrealistic expectations of what remote learning should be like for their kids at this time. Have you had to level set with parents about some of the adjustments or changes or realignment of expectations that they should have for their kids at this time?
I definitely have. I mean, I think the nature of working at an independent school, especially a single sex independent, so my school is all boys, and many of those boys have sisters. And so we have families who are really directly comparing their daughter's experience to their son's experience at our school. And no school's remote learning program is the same as another. There are variations. And so some of those tougher conversations have happened because maybe early on, their daughter had a lot of virtual contact with teachers because their school went with initially a synchronous model, and we were completely asynchronous to start. And so from the parent perspective, they see one child very busy and engaged, and another kind of, being able to get up late and go to bed late and do the work whenever they want, and they worry about the structure. And so some of those tougher conversations have been to just kind of let parents know that the model that we chose holds true to our identity and our values as a school, and that it we were going to ask for feedback and make adjustments over time, and we then followed through on that promise. So I think it's the tougher conversations are, they're not bad to have. They're really important to have, because it really helps you understand what people's biggest worries and concerns are, and to take those into account as you're continuing to evolve your program. And that's true all the time, even when we're not under remote learning. It's important to just make sure that if people are unsatisfied, that they're heard, so that that perspective can be considered.
Right. I think there's a comment earlier about this feeling of failure, that we're not doing enough. And I understand, I imagine this must be a common feeling amongst both parents and especially teachers, many of whom hold themselves to very high standards. I imagine you must have teachers who, I mean, do you have teachers who you think are placing unreasonable and undue burdens and demands on themselves? And if so, I mean, like, what are the common areas in which you find that they just have these very high expectations that maybe they don't need to, or it's okay to not hold yourself to such high standards or high expectations during this time? And what are those areas that you've seen from either yourself or from your colleagues?
I definitely worry about some of my teachers and the level of burnout that we're getting towards. And I think that for some teachers, they're like, well, you know, we only have a couple months of school left. I can power through until then. And like, to me right now, it's just, you know, teachers are so generous with their time and their effort and wanting to be there for their kids constantly. And we don't have that same level of interaction right now. And so it's very challenging. I think for all of us, the most challenging thing is that we are working with children, and that's different than I think working with anything else. Like, just the amount of emotion that I feel with my students in my class versus my colleagues, it's different, honestly. And I love and care about my colleagues very much. I have some of my best friends as my colleagues. It just feels different than dealing with a child. And, you know, I think Kerry has said a couple times over, like, this, I'm being heard, and let people know that they're being heard. And I think that might be just one of the biggest things to be concentrating on right now. And as we are assigning work to students, just remembering that the feedback part might be the most important part right now. And so if you would have assigned 10 problems before, scale it back a little bit so that you're sure that you can get to all the feedback, because assigning work and then getting yourself behind on grading and all of that isn't really helping anybody, and it's not contributing to that, like, allowing students to make sure that they are heard in that moment. And again, you know, as I was saying before, I do think that some of our students are feeling real academic wins right now, because they're hearing from their teacher, like, you're doing a great job, I'm so proud of you for doing this. And I just think that's the most important thing that we can be communicating to them right now, or that we do give ourselves the extra time to give some extra individualized feedback, because you can't sit with the student one-on-one in the classroom right now, but you can give a short little video feedback clip. We're doing a lot of just a flip grid, instead of just typing an email back to a student or writing a written comment, just give a short little flip grid response to them so that they can see your face, or that you can write with your hand. There's that whiteboarding feature, which is fantastic for us math teachers. And so I think right now that might be the most important thing to remember: scale back so that you can really concentrate on the feedback and the communication piece.
Yeah, a couple things I want to add on to that. First, you know, teachers, we're adjusting to just working from home. I mean, we went from having to plan when we're going to use the bathroom, right, to now trying to find a place where you can work and, you know, juggle everything else that's going on, right? So that's an adjustment. Let's, like, give grace to ourselves. That's a huge adjustment right there. And one thing, two other quick points that I'll make is that one is that in terms of, this is I really encourage teachers to get input from whether it's parents or other stakeholders to help you with the design, to kind of give you some feedback in terms of if it's too much. Quick example is that some of my work in social emotional learning curriculum for elementary, I created a lesson for a remote learning environment based on their goals. And I really tried to scale it down, thinking about, okay, could students do this independently? So I thought I had a really good lesson that was really feasible. I shared it with a couple of therapist colleagues, and they told me, Angela, you're doing too much. Like, that's way too much. And so I needed that check, you know, as a trained educator and like thinking about learning goals. And, you know, I just think we're already kind of primed to do too much, so that when we can get feedback from others, that's really helpful. And, you know, many of you are mentioning in comments, like you serve communities where there's 90% free and reduced lunch, and just thinking about their needs. We have to acknowledge there's a lot of suffering going on in the world, right? There's a lot of suffering. People are really struggling, and that can really take our toll as educators. And we want to give everything to be able to help. But part of that is also being able to set realistic expectations so that you could be your best self and help in a way that's manageable, and that you're going to be there for like a marathon.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great segue to, I think, a lot of the comments and some of the questions we've also seen just around this issue of what is reasonable in the context of equity in terms of access to either you know, technology, right? I mean, we talked a lot about digital tools, but we know that that's not the case for many students. Or equity in terms of just your environments, you know, your home environments. Maybe you have parents who are, you know, emergency workers, who need essential workers who may not be there. How do you think about adjusting or you know, shaping appropriate expectations in light of the recognition that there is inequitable access to resources at this time?
So I think one of the things that this really shines a light on is, I think there's a lot of talk about teachers, but school counselors, school adjustment counselors, school psychologists, you know, learning coaches, special ed teachers who provide some of these other supports are just as important as ever right now. And it's important for classroom teachers to really partner with those people and learn as much as they can about their child situation, their student situation. Of course, with regard to privacy, I mean, we want to make sure that the information that's shared is shared properly, but you know, we need to make sure that as teachers, we're not just focusing on our students from a teaching and learning perspective, but we're really getting to know how you know, maybe they are almost a different kid than they were 4 weeks ago because of what has happened, and how might that impact their academic work, and how can we support them. And on the other hand, there may be students who are doing great and are ready for a challenge, right? And so we need to make sure that we're able to respond to both of those situations with some humanity and professionalism at the same time. And I think we can, as teachers, we're up to the task, as long as, like Angela has been stressing, as long as we give ourselves some grace when it doesn't go perfectly, because it's not going to. But we also need to remember that some students may struggle and some students may be okay right now, and we're gonna have the opportunity to interact with a variety of situations in any one class.
Angela or Stacey, any comments from your end around this equity piece that's always kind of a foundational part of any conversation around education, and especially technology?
Yeah, I mean, as an early adopter of educational technology and thinking about how we can leverage it to address inequities, you know, what we often see with technology, it can also amplify inequities, and this pandemic for sure is amplifying inequities that are currently going on. And so a lot of this is about thinking of our resources and how we're allocating resources, and looking as part of a bigger team like Kerry, how you're mentioning, and also just community providers, where I've seen you know, gains in terms of like tackling this are where in communities you're really working hand in hand with community organizations, right, who are already working with these communities. And so I think that's a key piece. Sometimes that's behind the scenes that teachers aren't seeing that it's going on. So it's one way in schools we can lift up the community organizations who may have more interactions with students and families that are struggling. They're going to be the heroes, you know, in making sure that we meet the needs of all of our students. One quick thing too that both Kerry and Stacey have mentioned, one thing I think is to keep it important that for some young people, working on school is a coping strategy. It's an escape, right? And so I think that's key, that some students may be engaging in more material because we're providing escape from them, a positive coping skill to deal with all the suffering that's going on.
On the, I mean, just sticking with the technology and equity piece a little bit, there are some questions around like offline tools or kind of, you know, what have been like kind of effective or kind of simple, maybe simple, maybe too overstating it, but what are some effective like offline means that you've seen being used to engage the students, whether it's for schoolwork or just in other, you know, check-in ways?
I had one of the first projects I had my own class do is oral presentations. And I had them do it by drafting the visuals on a piece of paper and taping it to a window because it backlights it. And then I had just said, have one of your parents take a video of you giving your oral presentation on their phone and then upload it to this Flipgrid. And all of that can be done on a phone. And so even if a student doesn't have access to a Chromebook or an iPad or a laptop, there are some things that can be done just with a simple smartphone that we know due to subsidies and programs, many people, no matter their income, have access to that and have access to cell service. So there are ways, you know, we can just pick up the phone and call students to have some interactions with them that way. We can, that type of project that I just mentioned also encourages academic conversations between parents and children because they'll need someone to operate that camera for them and help them set the shot and, you know, give them feedback on their public speaking. And so there are lots of different creative ways that we can encourage kids to use what's in their home. I also had my students create a sculpture using anything outside or inside their house. And some students went out and built a pile of rocks in their yard. Some built something with Legos in their basement. Others took a shoebox and painted it, and that was their sculpture based on their design. And it was really incredible to see how differently they chose to express themselves and then just take a picture and send it to me. So there are lots of things we can do to make sure they're not just sitting in front of a screen, they're active and engaged, but then they can submit it digitally with very simple devices.
Stacey, not to put you on the spot, but I think that, you know, you've got, you know, you often write and, you know, share on EdSurge about some of your tips for interesting things to do with tools that are both digital or maybe not. Any fun activities that you've kind of come across?
I think that if whatever we're talking about, it's hard to do anything without having any technology in place at all. And I will just say that my personal experience is coming from a very privileged place of I really don't have to worry about students having access to these tools. But I think that one of the biggest tools, which Kerry has talked about, is just like being able to use our phones, and Flipgrid has been one of the best tools that I can recommend right now because any student can do it from their phone. They can also do it from their laptop. And so for some families, it's not that they don't have devices at home, they just don't have enough for every child to have a device at a time. And so the more we can use the phone, and then, just even using our phone and hovering it over a piece of paper and talking about whatever work that students have done on a piece of paper. It doesn't have to be a super fancy screencast or using any real fancy tools or doing digital inking and annotation. I mean, it can be a piece of paper that's printed out and then just use your phone. Like the power of video is, I think, huge and can't be understated. And, as a math teacher, just the handwriting and allowing students to see our handwriting, I would much rather see handwriting, a picture of it, or a video literally with somebody writing under the phone, than seeing it all typed as equations, because it just doesn't feel as natural and it's harder to follow. I really do feel than the handwriting. And so I don't know, that would be my thing, is like, how can we continue these conversations? How can we keep these conversations going? And I think that Flipgrid is an amazing way for students to see one another asynchronously, so you don't have to plan a set class time. And they can still talk out their feelings, and everybody can have a chance to contribute in that way, because a lot of times, even if you're having a Google Meet, as we see here, there's like some awkward pauses that if we were all sitting on a panel, probably wouldn't feel that way, because we would be, you know, vibing off of one another's energy and know when the next person's going to speak. And so I think for some kids, it's very intimidating to speak up in a Google Meet. And so, you know, can we offer some of these other tools to allow them to still have their voice heard by their whole class asynchronously?
All right, final question. Why isn't internet connectivity a utility like electricity? I'm just kidding. That's more of probably a better question for the FCC. Anyways, we are at time, and I want to give a big thanks once again to our panelists, Angela, Kerry, and Stacey. This was a wonderful conversation, and the hour just went by like so fast. We will be sharing a recording of both the video and audio of this, and I'll be writing a summary of this and publishing this on EdSurge as well sometime next week. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Again, I'm Tony Wan. I am the managing editor at EdSurge. We provide the latest resource and news about how technology is shaping how we learn and teach. You can sign up for our free newsletters or find more resources at edsurge.com. And to check out more of our future webinars, go to edsurge.com/e/webinars. So with that, thank you so much and have a great afternoon, have a great Friday, and have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you. Bye.